And now to get a whole new take on all of this, our reporter roundtable, Kim Strassel of the Wall Street Journal, Peter Baker, White House correspondent for the New York Times, Michael Gerson of the Washington Post, Ruth Marcus, also with the Washington Post, and Michael Crowley, the deputy Washington bureau chief for Time magazine. Well, Kim, give me your thoughts on the events of this week, because I see this week as kind of a turning point.
It is. It's always good to have a president who has a plan rather than not, so yay on that. And he gave a very good speech at the UN, and I think has also been very careful what we saw Mr. Blinken saying too, of not putting a timeline on this, which is better than what we've had in the past, and that he's actually, I think, gearing up America for the understanding that this is going to take a while. I do nonetheless think that there are some real problems, though, that we still face, one of which is that, yes, we're going in with allies. Many of those are allies who are still very distrustful of us, given his walk back on the Syrian red line in the past. I think the scope of the mission is still not necessarily big enough to get done what needs to get done, and that includes taking out Assad in Syria. And I think this promise on ground troops, no ground troops, is going to come back and be a problem for the president and for our ability to succeed.
Peter Baker, you cover the White House. What do you, I've asked this question about 3 times this morning, but I'm going to ask you too. What do you think was the tipping point for this president?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because I do think we see, especially in this last week, as Kim was saying, a different approach. And I know Tony Blinken wanted to tell us how consistent this was, and you can certainly make that argument, but this does not feel like a president who's leading from behind. He is taking ownership of this campaign. He is, in fact, putting the American troops in the front, even as he's talking about the coalition. And he's speaking about it in repeated ways in public, in a way he really didn't do in past foreign policy crises, where he kind of would give a speech and then return to domestic issues. And I think that something over the summer, obviously, you know, the fall of Mosul, the fall of Tikrit, the idea that these guys are sweeping through Iraq in a much more decisive way, you know, just turned things around inside his White House, and even before the beheadings. The beheadings obviously added to that, but I think that was before that happened.
I think the UN speech itself was very, very important. I mean, this is such a contrast to, say, the West Point speech that was only a few months ago that talked about disengaging from the world. The president stood in front of the world community and asserted the U.S. has a leading role in the Middle East, and he asserted the doctrine of preemption, which says we're going after threats before they arise. And he talked, it was really a moment of continuity, because this is not the Bush foreign policy. This is American foreign policy for this foreseeable future. It's not the result of some ideology. It's the result of the briefing he gets every morning, which is scary. And I think that it's good to have that continuity.
Well, I mean, I basically think the president had no choice here. I mean, you can't have Americans beheaded on television and not make some response to it, whether that solves the problem or not. I think, number one, you have to have a response to that, to let the American people know that, no, we're not going to stand for this.
I think that Peter makes an important point. The tipping point of needing to have American action actually came before the beheadings. The beheadings gave him the kind of public and political space to do what I think he understood needed to be done before that. I think the critical question, and Kim kind of alludes to this, is going forward, what then? What if this air campaign doesn't work? The generals are all telling us you cannot get to success in Syria solely from the air. So we are going to stand up this now notional force. What happens a year from now? A year from now, everybody understands the problem will still be there. But what if ISIS has expanded a year from now, expanded into Jordan, expanded into Turkey? Where will we be? And that's a question that the president has not adequately answered.
And our allies are worried about that, Bob. I was in New York this week for the UN General Assembly events, and I ran into an official in the government of one of these Arab coalition partners. And I said to him, how long are you guys in this for? And he gave me a kind of crossways look and said, how long are you guys in this for? Yeah. They don't entirely trust us. They don't entirely trust our resolve. I will say, Bob, though, I think we are seeing, it's kind of a cliche, but I really do think we've seen a mission creep play out here. Remember, this started out, that first speech from the president, a humanitarian intervention to save the Yazidi on the mountain and protect Erbil. Then it was about freeing the Mosul Dam. Then we started hearing about the Haditha Dam. Now we're striking Syria, ISIS in Syria. There's also another group now, Khorasan in Syria. Well, no ground ground troops. Well, define ground troops. Would that mean special forces on the guy doing spotting? Now we're hearing about a buffer zone, a no-fly zone. So where is it headed? It feels very improvised and open-ended. At the same time, we do have allies worrying that we're not going to follow through.
I know this morning that Tony Blinken said we're not going to repeat a ground invasion in the Middle East. But I mean, the question though is ground troops. Look, the nature of this strike has already changed just in the past week, in that when you've got armored personnel carriers you can target, it's one thing. When people are blending into the crowds, you have to have people on the ground that are gathering intelligence and directing strikes, and special operations teams that are going to take out terrorists. And I don't know how he keeps that promise, in particular with his own military saying that he's going to have to get there at some point.
Well, I mean, it seems to me the president has to do whatever is necessary. If there, if there is a credible threat, and they make the evaluation that this is threatening the homeland of the United States, then the president has to be prepared to do that.
Well, but it may be that a President Clinton or a President Cruz or somebody is going to have to do that presidential thing and take, I hope it doesn't come to that, but whatever might be the necessary steps to take the next step. You call it mission creep. I just might call it important steps for the national defense, and we need to be prepared
But
for
also
that.
we should keep a sense of proportionality here. I think there's been an understandable emotional revulsion toward ISIS after we saw those beheading videos, but Al-Qaeda in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and also as we've seen these Khorasan guys who are part of the Al-Qaeda core based in Pakistan, they're still coming at us. And actually, I think if something, God forbid, were to happen tomorrow, I would think it would be likelier that it would be Al-Qaeda in Yemen rather than ISIS. So let's just keep a sense of proportion.
Part of your previous panel, Bob, had mentioned the distinction between Iraq and Syria. The border is gone, but our approach is different in each of these places because we don't have a ground force in Syria to work with the way we do in Iraq. The Iraqi army has proved to be quite dysfunctional, but there is at least an army there to work with and a government that we're now allied with. In Syria, we have the Free Syrian Army, a group of supposedly moderate opposition figures. And the truth is, they have not been effective. The president himself said it was a fantasy to think that we could arm them and they would be an effective ground force. Okay, what happens if that fantasy then doesn't work? And we run out of targets that we can see from the air, as Kim was talking about, not having spotters on the ground.
Let me just ask you about the political fallout from this. Do any of you think this will be an issue in these fall congressional campaigns? Because Speaker Boehner said this morning, if the president wants a vote on this, he said, I'll be happy to call everybody back to Washington and vote on it. But as we all know, Congress turned tail and ran home.
I think he's
the
pretty
first
confident.
available opportunity. They don't want to be on the record on this.
No.
And it's only, I'll be happy to come, but only if he asks. And the president says, I would welcome a vote, but only if you guys go first. I think the person who really deserves a lot of credit this morning is Senator Tim Kaine, who first of all took on his own president of his own party, saying he doesn't have the necessary authority and he needs to call Congress back to do it. And then he took on his colleagues for being feckless and not standing up to their own constitutional responsibilities. But I think the short version of it, in terms of effect on the midterm, not.
But I think it's likely to be very marginal. There could be some rallying effect. There could be some dispiriting of anti-war Democrats. That's a significant portion. Yeah, that's true. It's hard to measure. I think it's likely to be marginal. This does help, though, internationalist candidates in the 2016 run-up. Hillary Clinton is one of them, by the way, who was right on Syria and has told everyone that that's true. But it also doesn't help somebody like Rand Paul, who a year ago could talk about drones and NSA, and now he has to sound like Ronald Reagan, which he does not sound like Ronald Reagan.
I think, though, in deciding that they were going to push this past the midterm has actually created a bigger political problem, which we're going to address not 2 years from now, but in fact in December in the lame duck. And it's going to be a real problem because you're going to have the president's anti-war left members of Congress who were reluctant to do this anyway. They now will not have the pressure of an election to sort of push them along behind the president either. And you have his promises of no ground troops, and he's going to be wanting more authority possibly at that point. And there could be a very huge and ugly debate that could not go his way in the end.
Huge and ugly debate, but a really healthy debate. Look at what happened happened in Great Britain this week.
But just looking past the midterms, you mentioned the NSA. This was topic A for us for so long a few months ago, and we're not hearing about it now. And I think that effort is very much on hold, and the people in support of much more aggressive surveillance feel like the tide has turned their way very much.
Here's the other way it can affect the midterm elections. It's taken the president's domestic agenda off the radar screen, right? He wanted to spend this fall talking about the minimum wage, about pay equity, about issues that might galvanize particularly women voters and get Democrats to the polls. He's not going to be able to get that message through at a time when we're focused on beheadings and airstrikes.